For our 200th episode of the Old Front Line, we return to where we started on the Somme battlefields of 1916 and follow the tracks and pathways across those vast open fields to where men from Yorkshire and the Midlands attacked the German positions at a place called Nab Valley. I'm recording this episode on the 1st of July, a day that needs little introduction here. It's the anniversary of the Battle of the Somme, and it's an appropriate day to produce a podcast about an event that took place on that blackest of Great War days. For many of us, the 1st of July, if we're passionate about the Great War, is a day of contemplation, when we think perhaps of the soldiers in our own family tree, or the men and the women that we've researched, the stories that we've found as we've crisscrossed that old front line. The Somme seems to draw us ever back to its pathways, and the men of the Somme who marched that way in 1916. And for many today who have visited the Somme on this anniversary, they'll have gravitated towards those famous locations connected to the 1st of July story. They're well visited, and we've discussed them on this podcast many times. There's so much more to the Somme than just those big places, I think. It's important to visit them and visit them again. But there's another Somme, a wider Somme, and it's important to remember that too. And along that old front line of the Somme, there are many quiet places, perhaps less visited, and that's where our Somme walk will take us today. And aside from recording this episode on the Somme anniversary, this one also marks the 200th episode of the Old Front Line. It's quite incredible, really, to think there's been 200 episodes. And just recently I've had emails from people catching up on the podcast from the very beginning. That's quite a long journey these days, with the average episode from 30, 45 minutes to well beyond an hour. And we've covered so much in those 200 episodes, so many different aspects of the Great War, not just the war on the Western Front, but beyond the Western Front. But there's still so far to go. I do get regular emails where people worry that we've kind of used up all the stories, but there's so many. This is such a vast subject, and we haven't covered so many things yet, like Mesopotamia, Palestine, Salonika, to name just a few of those fronts beyond the old front line of the Western Front. And so many aspects of those far corners of even that Western Front battlefield we've yet to cover. And some of those that we covered in the early days, I kind of find myself going back there and doing a kind of retrospective. And that's something that I'm aiming to do later this week with a battlefield in northern France. So 200 episodes and a staggering number of downloads. It's well over 1.4 million now. We're creeping towards that 1.5 million mark. There's a definite kind of increase in listeners and people finding the podcast for the first time. And I can't thank all of you enough, really, for your support. Many of you listening from the very beginning, some of you joined more recently. All of it helps spread the word. Tell your friends, put it on your own social media, your Facebook, your Twitter, whatever it is that you use. Spread the word of the podcast, because we want people to remember the Great War. We want them to think of those stories that engage us, and hopefully they'll engage them too. We don't want this subject to disappear into the dusty pages of the past, to be locked up in some archive box and never seen again. And I don't think there's any fear of that ever really happening. And more podcasts are being produced, and that's a good thing too. It seems to me that podcasts are now pretty mainstream. They're here to stay. They're part of how we learn about a subject, how we engage with a subject. And as always, that can only be a force for good. So with this 200th episode in mind, the anniversary of the Battle of the Somme, we're heading off to pick up our virtual boots and pack and walk those pathways in Picardy with the skylarks high above as we head out across those Somme battlefields of 1916. So where are we on the Somme battlefields? We're close to a village that's just north of the town of Albert. This is Authuille. It was a village that was behind the British lines in 1916. Previously it had been used by the French. It was a route, a conduit up to the front line positions, which from this village were up towards the ridge in front of Nab Valley, or the high ground north of the village of Auvergne, both positions held by the Germans. And a network of trenches had been dug first by the French and then expanded on by the British on those slopes facing those ridges, facing those German positions in this kind of middle part of the 1916 Somme battlefield in terms of that 1st of July attack. This, where we are in the village of Authuille, there was a chateau here that was headquarters, there was a dressing station, there was a communal cemetery and extension where the dead from that dressing station who died of their wounds were buried, and some men killed in the front line were brought back there for burial. There were gun positions, there were Royal Engineers stores, there were depots of equipment for the front line trenches. It was all part of that kind of infrastructure that was behind the British front line on almost every part of the Western Front. But we're starting not in the village itself, we're just outside of it, on a bridge with a tree-lined avenue in front of us. And that bridge sits across the River Ancre, the Anchor, that runs through this northern area, central area of the Somme battlefields. It's a river that gave its name to some of the fighting, and for this section of it, it was behind the British front line. To the north, as it got nearer to villages like Beaucourt and Hamel, it really was part of the battlefield, but here it was part of the route up. And the Royal Engineers built footbridges across the river in this area to enable men to get over them and to get up to the communication trenches beyond. So Authuille, a small little village that you could just pass through in moments, was an important part of the British line in 1916. And later on in the war, it was captured in the German offensive of March. It was fighting here around this part of the Ancre, and tanks were involved alongside the British trying to push the Germans back. There's some famous photographs of tanks lined up in some of the streets just to the other side of the village from where we are. And the ground here was retaken by the 38th Welsh Division in the August 1918 Somme battles. But those are all stories for another day. We're focusing very much on the 1916 story, and in particular the first day of the Battle of the Somme. So ahead of us is a tree-lined avenue. Once these were very common across Picardy, they were very much part of the 1916 landscape. When we look at photographs and war art of the Battle of the Somme, we see these tree-lined avenues being depicted. The main Albert Bapaume road, when I first came to the Somme in the early 1980s, was tree-lined like this, but there's few of them that survive now, with tree diseases sadly being commonplace in the last few decades. A lot of trees have been cut down, and there are only a handful really on the actual battlefield area that give us a kind of flavour of that landscape of more than a century ago. So for me, this is always a special place to walk or to cycle or to drive up this avenue to get a sense of that landscape of the past. And if we follow that tree-lined avenue and we look out into the often flooded ground around us, we get a sense of what this ground was like. It was a place of movement rather than the place where you'd build things because of the proximity of the river. So the gun positions tended to be just beyond where we are. And as we come up to a bend in the road ahead of us, where to the right that would take us to Auvergne, Nab Valley and La Boisselle beyond, and to the left up to Nab, we can see just ahead of us, amongst the trees, a crucifix. And as this is a kind of a corner, much more of a corner, I think, in 1916, this is one of the places that became known as Crucifix Corner, perhaps more famous than the one that battlefield visitors today are familiar with, which is the Crucifix Corner near to Bazentin-le-Petit, over on the high wood part of the battlefield. This one was part of a main route up to the front line, and in those weeks and months before the Somme, British troops of the 51st Highland Division had taken over this sector in the summer of 1915, a year before the battle had started, and they'd named a lot of the trenches in this area between Authuille and the neighbouring village of Authuille. They had used this as a route up to their forward positions, just as the French had done before them. There were very sheer chalk escarpments here, which were dug into, and just beyond it the communication trenches started. So unit after unit being relieved or coming back would come through this route. So Crucifix Corner became a familiar place to the units that served on this part of the battlefield. There's a quarry at the back of the Crucifix that we can easily see that for years was a used car depot full of old wrecks. But within it, it's been cleared out now, we can see some of the signs of the war positions. And further along the bank, particularly in the spring and winter, you can see machine gun positions and trench mortar positions, dugout entrances, all kinds of things. This was all part of that infrastructure built on these escarpments, not facing the enemy, safe-ish from shell fire, where you'd expect to find troops sheltering. So this would have been a position that very much, particularly at night, would have been alive, with men going up, men coming back, and men living in the banks and the escarpments and the stunted trees that would have been here then, living in this area. And whenever I come here, it's an evocative place. It's not the original crucifix that was destroyed in 1918. It's a replacement, but nevertheless it looks down on the same road, a tree-lined road, and it is very evocative of the past. And you can kind of sense the shadows of the movement of all those men that came through here in that great battle in 1916, because even beyond the 1st of July, this remained a route up to the forward positions. And I'm often reminded of a quote from the fantastic Malcolm Brown documentary from 1976, which was presented by Leo McKern, a great thing to watch on the anniversary of the Battle of the Somme, available on YouTube. There's an account of one of the soldiers who came up here, a young Kitchener's Army recruit, and in the dead of night, as they moved up to take part in the Battle of the Somme, a voice echoed across the Ancre marshes towards them, calling out to them, "You came of your own accord, you bloody fools," or words to that effect, implying that there they were, eager volunteers. They'd not been forced to come, they'd signed up to come, and now they were heading for their rendezvous in the front line, wherever that may take them. And I'm also reminded of a little extract from George Coppard's With a Machine Gun to Cambrai. George Coppard had joined as a teenage soldier, a boy soldier in the Queen's Regiment at the beginning of the war, and then transferred into the Machine Gun Corps, and he was here with the 12th Eastern Division in reserve in the approach to the Battle of the Somme. And he recalled this memory of Crucifix Corner in 1916. There was a terrific crowd of troops and vehicles at Crucifix Corner. The road forked there, and in the angle, commanding the approach, there stood a huge crucifix. The sorrowful face of Christ gazed down at the turmoil below. I remember looking at his face, a glance only. There was no time for more. Many men who had passed by on their way to the front not many hours before were now dead, and many more were to follow them. So it's a place that touched many of the veterans. They remembered this crucifix, this big crucifix on this corner, and it was a route, as we've said, to their rendezvous, whatever future lay ahead. There's also a modern memorial here that came about around about the time of the centenary. It's kind of circular bronze, which is called the Nymph, and it's a replica of a chalk carving that is known to have been somewhere in this escarpment here at Crucifix Corner. French troops in the early period of the war, 1914-15, when they'd been here, had carved this into the chalk bank. And although it had disappeared by war's ending, there was photographic evidence of it. I think it had appeared in quite a few kind of newspapers at the time. It depicted the soldiers, it depicted various scenes, and I'll put a picture of it onto the podcast website so you can see what it's like with the crucifix in the background. So it's a kind of a reminder that this isn't just a British sector. The French were here before. And what we do from this position to begin our walk, or continue our walk, is to take a track just to the right of the crucifix as the road bends, heading up towards the high ground that overlooks Mash Valley. We take a track, a metal track, tarmac track that takes us up the hillside, and it replicates really the kind of route that soldiers took when they were getting to this kind of position beyond Crucifix Corner. They were by now into the communication trenches that ran here, the trenches that linked reserve areas with those three static lines of positions ahead of them: the reserve trench, the support trench, and eventually the front line. But it's nice to take these kind of tracks that takes you across that landscape, following the route of those troops in 1916. And again, in the eve of the Battle of the Somme, all these trenches would have been busy with men moving up, battalions getting ready for the assault, taking up equipment. In the distance would have been the rumbling of the bombardment and the flash of flame. The shells were hitting the positions towards Mash Valley, towards the village of Auvergne, and to the north towards Chat Val. And in between, they would have seen the treetops of Authuille Wood, which would have been in full bloom in July, late June, early July of 1916, and despite the shell fire, seemed to have been a fairly consistent wood in the way that it wasn't a matchstick wood, wasn't smashed to pieces like woods became as the Battle of the Somme moved on. So this is a place where we kind of think about the eve of battle, where men were not fighting here, they were moving up to take part in the fighting. And the track takes us gradually uphill. There is one that goes off to the left that could take you direct to the ground near to Authuille Wood, and there's a cemetery there, Blighty Valley, that you could visit. But we're going to carry straight on up the track to a point where it reaches a T-junction, and there we're getting nearer to the front line positions. So we've come from a rear area, we've marched up a bit of lane past Crucifix Corner into the area where the communication trenches were. We've gone through the reserve line, we're coming up to the support line, and beyond the crest was where the forward trenches, the front line trenches, were located. And if you look at trench maps of this area, and the Western Front Association Trench Mapper site is a really good way of doing that. It's online for free. You can see trench maps that are overlaid onto Google Maps. And you can see that kind of line here was quite complex, coming down from Chat Val around the very peak of Authuille Wood, coming over a valley known as Nab Valley, which we'll come to later on in the walk, and then swinging up over this high ground across towards the village of Auvergne and the two valleys, Mash Valley, La Boisselle, and beyond that, Sausage Valley. And in this area, in the approach to the Battle of the Somme, quite a few different British units had passed through here, but it was a sector that for some months had been the responsibility of the British 8th Division, which was a regular army division that had been in France since November of 1914. Very few of its original regulars left by this stage of the conflict, with all the battles that it fought in from the latter end of the 1914 fighting through to Neuve-Chapelle and Albers Ridge and other engagements of 1915, and then it had moved down to the Somme and been very much a Somme division in the approach to the battle. And they had worked on quite a lot of the infrastructure that was here. And as we go left up this track and follow it, we see more and more of this big long shape of Authuille Wood. That comes from the edge of Authuille village down through part of a long valley called in one point Blighty Valley, because there was a dressing station there receiving men coming back with wounds that would hopefully be a blighty one, a wound serious enough to take them home to dear old Blighty, Britain. And it continues kind of pointing, almost pointing a finger towards where the German trenches were at the other end of the valley, tucked in that ground between the villages of Auvergne and Chiapval. And the ground that we're kind of looking at to our left as we walk up here was the dividing line between two divisions on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the 8th, whose sector this was, where we are now, and the 32nd Division, who were further to the north, who would attack just beyond Authuille Wood, up towards positions like the Leipzig salient and Chiapval village itself. And that's slightly out of the area that we're going to discuss in this particular walk. But as we continue up here and we look down into that ground between us, it drops away towards the edge of Authuille Wood. There's a bit of rough ground there, which in 1916 was the site of a position known as Quarry Post. There was a small quarry there, and the Royal Army Medical Corps had established a small casualty reception area, dressing station, to receive wounded coming back from the front line. It appears to have been used before the Battle of the Somme, but obviously it was probably geared up for expected casualties in this great offensive, although the troops assembled here, of course, were told that it was going to be a bit of a walkover. And this would have been a place that the wounded coming back from the battlefield in the very front line from regimental aid posts would be brought back by the stretcher bearers, the regimental stretcher bearers, to this dressing station at Quarry Post for treatment there by the RAMC, a field ambulance, and then passed back through places like Authuille, where we started, for further treatment there, and beyond that were the casualty clearing stations. And there was, at the time of the conflict, a small battlefield cemetery, because wherever you have any kind of medical post, there will always be graves, because some men sadly die of their wounds. And there was a small battlefield wartime cemetery here that was eventually closed and moved to another location. But I remember in the 1990s, when I was doing the preparation for my book, Walking the Somme, and this is part of one of the routes, someone was walking the ground about that time and had gone down to where Quarry Post was and had found evidence of human remains, and the War Graves Commission had been called, and I think one or two casualties which were not identified were found and subsequently reburied. Now, at that stage in the 1990s, that was a kind of turning point between the reburial of the dead in one place and the move towards the idea of burying them as close as possible to where they were found, and if possible with men of their regiment if that was known. So in the early 90s, they were still burying soldiers that were found in France at Turlington Cemetery near Boulogne, and I think those lads that were found at Quarry Post, that's where they ended up. A few years later, they probably would have been reburied in Lonsdale or Auvergne Military Cemetery, perhaps. But the policy has completely changed now, and when casualties are found, there's a lot more investigation, a lot more scientific methods are available to the War Graves Commission, and as much as possible, the men are buried in an appropriate place. But if we then return to the track with the ground ahead of us, and we can see the track continuing to a road with the village of Auvergne to our right and Chiapval up to our left, and the big wooded area of Authuille Wood to our left too. We've come into, as we say, this kind of middle area of the 1st of July advance, where men of the 70th Brigade were located on the 1st of July. A brigade, an infantry brigade, was made up of 4 infantry battalions and commanded by a brigadier general, and in this case that was Brigadier General Gordon, and in his command were 4 infantry battalions, the 11th Battalion, the Sherwood Foresters, the 8th Battalion, the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, and the 8th and the 9th Battalions of the York and Lancaster Regiment. And this is where their 1st of July story took place, in this ground immediately in front of us. And what a story it was. So we're going to continue along this track to that point where it meets the road to look at their collective rendezvous with death that day at the Nab Valley, our next stop. We've come to the area where this track that we've been walking along meets the Auvergne-Authuille road. There's a quite steep bank on our right-hand side, and we can't see the village of Auvergne to our right. We can see over the treetops towards Valley to our left, and we can't see the village of Authuille at all. That's tucked away completely out of sight back behind us to our left from where we are. And this part of the valley that comes from Quarry Post alongside the edge of the wood was known as Nab Valley. That extension of the valley was known as Nab Valley, and this position around where this track meets the road is marked on the trench maps as the Nab. This position, known as the Nab, was most likely named after the Nab in the Lake District, which was a fell of over 1,800 feet and was near Ullswater, and listed by Alfred Wainwright, making it a popular walking destination both then and now. And probably it was given that name by men of the 11th Battalion, the Border Regiment, known as the Lonsdales, who we'll speak about a little bit later in this walk, who were in this sector with the 32nd Division in the lead up to the Battle of the Somme in 1916. But it could be yet again one of those completely random names that appears on trench maps of this period. So what can we see from where we're standing now? So we've got that high bank to our right. The road disappears out of sight to our right towards the village of Auvergne, and then it drops down into Nab Valley to our left, runs along the edge of that finger of Authuille Wood, and continues slightly out of sight as it heads towards Authuille village and the outskirts of Valley to the right of the road. You can see there's quite a lot of dead ground here, and if we're standing very close to the jump-off points of the British front line, with the Germans just ahead of us in the fields beyond, we can see that any troops coming out would be particularly vulnerable in this area unless the German defences were destroyed. And as we mentioned, in terms of who was here on the 1st of July, this is where those units of the 70th Brigade were located. The 11th Sherwood Foresters, the 8th King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry, and the 8th and the 9th York and Lancs. Now, they were Kitchener's army units, and the 70th Brigade had originally been in the 23rd Division and been detached from the 23rd and posted to the 8th in the lead up to the Somme offensive. And this, for these men, was their first major time in action in terms of their First World War experience. So while they'd been in trenches previous to this, they'd suffered casualties in the kind of day-to-day activities of trench warfare, they still retained a very, very high percentage of their original enlistees. And although these weren't PALS battalions, they were recruited in specific areas of Yorkshire and the Midlands, Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, in the case of the Sherwood Foresters. So if you kind of look at the kind of towns and places where the casualties of these battalions came from, you can see a kind of an enlistment area coming out of it. It's less so with the 8th King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry, which kind of covers quite a big area of Yorkshire, but there are some places where these men came from that dominate the story, and we'll again talk about that down the line. The brigade was commanded by Brigadier General H. Gordon, regular soldier who'd been out since the early period of the war, and his men had trained for the assaults like everyone else in training grounds behind the lines, which was not really kind of training that you can compare to later on in the war when men were properly prepared for battle. I would say that most of these battalions really had only rudimentary training, and they weren't really prepared for some of the things that were about to take place. They were proficient in their arms and their equipment and the weapons that they had, and being Kitchener's units, they had quite high morale. You know, when you look at the Battle of the Somme, these men weren't all sitting depressed in their trenches on the eve of the Somme. They were very eager to take part and very eager to do their bit on the battlefield. And Brigadier General Gordon's men were tasked with attacking the northern part of what was called the Auvergne Spur, which here would lead them into that valley, Nab Valley, dominated by the enemy positions ahead, and thus, as we've said, a potential kill zone. the attack, in many ways, when we look at it, this is a brigade attack with 4 battalions, with other units attacking to their right and to their left, so that's south and north, effectively. It depended on the success, both to the north and south. Otherwise, these men might be walking into a wall of German fire. So the barrage here, apart from the normal divisional level artillery and the heavy artillery that was detailed to pound the German positions, was also here backed up by an increased and quite high number of Stokes mortars, dropping mortar shells onto the German positions. So quite close range firing, quite accurate firing. Good Stokes mortar team can get 8 bombs up in the air before the first one lands, and they can do a lot of destructive power to forward positions and strong points. So that was all part of the kind of assistance that was laid on to give this infantry assault some kind of success. But what happened at 0 hour? What happened at 7:30 in the morning on the 1st of July 1916? Well, the 8th Battalion, the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, and the 8th York and Lancs led the assault in this area, very much a Yorkshire attack. And initially, as they went over and the whistles blew, there wasn't a massive response from the German positions, and they did quite well in crossing no man's land and got into the German first line trenches and then bombed their way up the communication trenches into their second line positions. But by then the Germans had fully reacted ahead of them, and as the follow-up waves came to reinforce them, fighting their way forward, they got cut down in no man's land and the area around the Nab where we are now. Casualties were heavy as the Germans then counter-attacked those who were in their trenches, and gradually those men were pushed back from the second line position, back down the communication trenches. Very often they put bomb blocks there and they'd be fighting either side of those blocks in a single bit of communication trench, and then back eventually towards the German front line, which had been taken in that early phase of the advance. And increasingly these men found themselves becoming isolated as those key attacks to the north and south failed. The failure to attack the rest and capture the rest of the Auvergne spur, the failure to get through Nab Valley, with battalions being annihilated by fire in that area, and to the north with the failure of the attack on Thiepval, meant these men were now potentially vulnerable. But according to timetable, the 9th York and Lancs, the sister battalion of the 8th, went forward next. They also came under heavy fire from the high ground south of Thiepval and the Germans north of Auvergne, who had now kind of dealt with some of the other attackers in their sectors, and very quickly that battalion melts away under this murderous fire. Brigadier General Gordon, now faced with this, with 2 battalions entangled in the German trenches, one that had gone up in support, having been cut down in no man's land and around the Nab, he had to make a decision. Did he send his 4th Assault Battalion forward, his final battalion in his brigade, which was already moving up almost like automatons to get forward and make their jump off and make their attack, or does he stop this attack? Remember, these men have no idea what's going on their flanks. Not really. They've got a vague idea. Poor communications, the lack of any kind of radio communication that really dogs commanders in this conflict compared to those a generation later in the Second World War, means that Gordon really has to carry on with the orders that he's given, which is to push on with the attack. So he sends his final battalion in, and that final battalion is the 11th Sherwood Foresters. They move up past the wounded, they step over the dead in the trenches, and as they go out across and through the British wire, they step over the dead in no man's land too, a kind of portent of doom of what was to come. The first wave of the Sherwood Foresters is almost immediately cut down, just short of the German wire, out there in the far end of Nab Valley, and the same fate befell those that followed. And at one point, a party of about 50-odd bombers and riflemen attempts, with a couple of officers, try and get across no man's land, but they too fail, and the attack here quite clearly also has failed. The survivors of the 8th King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry and the 8th York and Lancs, who were in that very first wave, were now cut off completely in the German trenches, and all contact with them was effectively lost. By midday, Brigadier General Gordon in the 70th Brigade Advance Headquarters received a call from Divisional Headquarters asking for another push forward in this area, but Brigadier General Gordon commented to his superior, "You seem to forget, sir, that there is now no 70th Brigade." The losses amongst these 4 battalions had been staggering. The 8th Battalion, King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, went into the attack with 25 officers, 1 medical officer who accompanied the men over the top, and 659 other ranks. Only the medical officer and 110 men reported back. All of the other officers were casualties. In the 8th York and Lancs, which had gone forward with them, they went over with 23 officers and 680 men. Only 68 men returned. All of the officers in this battalion were also casualties. The 9th York and Lancs that came up in support, remember they were cut down in no man's land as they tried to reach the other battalions. They went over with 25 officers and 736 men, and only 180 other ranks reported back that evening. Again, all of the officers became casualties. And in the 11th Sherwood Foresters, who went over with 27 officers and 710 men, they lost 21 officers and 508 other ranks. And when we look at the officers who were killed and wounded and posted missing, we discover that in those 4 battalions, all 4 battalion commanders became casualties. Lieutenant Colonel B.L. Madison of the 8th York and Lancs was killed. Lieutenant Colonel A.J.B. Addison of the 9th York and Lancs killed. Captain, Acting Lieutenant Colonel K.E. Powser, commanding 8th King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry, wounded, and Lieutenant Colonel H.F. Watson of the 11th Sherwood Foresters, also wounded. So Brigadier General Gordon lost all 4 of his battalion commanders. So the senior command element of these units was lost. 2 killed and 2 wounded. And when you look at the other officer casualties, pretty much every company commander and many of the platoon commanders are killed, wounded and missing. It was an absolutely staggering scale of loss, and one of the highest in the 1st of July battlefield for one brigade area. One of the officers in the 11th Sherwood Foresters that day was Edward Britton, brother of Vera Britton, author of that incredible Great War memoir, Testament of Youth, where we discover as a young middle-class woman, well-educated, well-connected, she becomes a VAD, member of the Volunteer Aid Detachment, serves in Malta and then France, but all of the young men in her life are consumed by the war. And her beloved brother was here, first time in action. He'd gone straight from Oxford into the Sherwood Foresters and was wounded in that attack as his battalion tried to move up to assist the other 3 that had been so heavily cut to pieces in the early phase of the battle. And he was later awarded the Military Cross for his bravery here, and the citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and leadership during an attack, he was severely wounded but continued to lead his men with great bravery and coolness until a second wound disabled him." So hit not just once, but twice here in the fighting around the Nab on the 1st of July. He recovered, he returned to his battalion. Sadly, he was killed in Italy when the 70th Brigade, these battalions that we've been speaking about, were in Italy at the end of the conflict. But for me, there's another connection to this area through the 8th and 9th York and Lancs, as they contained many men from the Sheffield, Rotherham and Barnsley area. When I was living in South Yorkshire and began to research some of the local war memorials and stories of men, particularly from Barnsley, I discovered that not everybody joined the POWs. In Sheffield, not everyone joined the Sheffield City Battalion. Rotherham was kind of dominated by the 1st, 5th York and Lancs Territorial Battalion, but not everyone joined that. And in Barnsley, the POWs battalions filled up so quickly that a lot of men went to join the 8th and the 9th York and Lancs. So when you look at the 1st of July casualties for Barnsley and Sheffield, it's not all about Sayre. One of the forgotten elements of the 1st of July story for South Yorkshire is this action here at the Nab and the tremendous losses that were sustained by those battalions. And when you look at the losses too sustained by the 8th Battalion King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry, that recruited in a much kind of broader spectrum across Yorkshire, but there was a lot of Sheffield men in it and some from the kind of Barnsley, Rotherham area too. So again, it kind of shows that even in a non-PALS battalion, when a battalion is wiped out in the way that these ones were here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, it just shows what kind of effect that those losses can have on a local community. And what's sad, really, when we stand here today, on this quiet corner of the Somme, rarely visited, I would say, is all it has is a simple wooden cross to remember what happened here. A simple wooden cross that someone has fixed to a fence post. I'll put a picture of it onto the podcast website. There's nothing else to mark what was one of the most devastating and costly sectors of the 1st of July battlefield along the entire front that day. So with the ghosts of the Nab, the ghosts of these 4 proud battalions behind us, we'll now turn left onto the road and continue past Authuille Wood up to Lonsdale Cemetery. From the Nab, we walk down the Authuille Road with Auvergne behind us, ahead of us in the distance, the wooded area, the finger of Authuille Wood pointing towards where the German positions were. And as we come up alongside the edge of the wood and we look in, particularly in the winter and spring, we can see the signs of trenches right alongside the road, part of the British front line positions. Authuille Wood, and I had the pleasure to visit the wood properly with the permission of the landowners some years ago, has a huge amount of trench positions in it, as all these woods do on the Somme. There's no active preservation of them, but they're working woods where there's shooting and tree planting and the other kind of commercial activities that woods are used for these days. So there's no kind of danger of them disappearing, but I think it's not always appreciated just how much First World War archaeology is in these places. And we get a glimpse of that as we walk up the hill here with those British trenches on our left. And that brings us up to a rising bit of ground with a new memorial on the left-hand side, a memorial to the Dorsetshire Regiment. And they had several battalions of the regiment fighting in this area of the battlefield, and in particular the one connected to Charles Dewey, who wrote Weary Road, that again a classic memoir of the First World War. But that is a kind of another story for another day. There are various units that fought in the ground that we've walked into that kind of lead us down a different corner of the Somme, and we will return to that one day. But what we've done is come this route to pay our respects to some of the dead from the ground where we've walked before around the Nab. So we'll take the path, which often in the height of summer with the crops high either side is like walking through a communication trench to what is Lonsdale Cemetery, tucked away from the road. The battlefields in this sector were not properly cleared during the 1916 battle. For the first 2.5 months there was heavy fighting, and even towards the end of the Somme campaign this was a ground that was shelled, much of it still in some kind of German direct observation or balloon observation, so the dead were not properly buried or buried hastily in battlefield positions like shell holes and trenches, and not really properly recovered until the fighting had moved on. The Germans were withdrawn to the Hindenburg Line in early 1917, and that's when this cemetery and quite a few others in this area were established. The original plot 1 of Lonsdale Cemetery is at a slightly different angle to some of the post-war concentrated graves, and as you come in here there's a big shelter above you on a high brick wall, and you go up some steps to go in. There's the Stone of Remembrance, and you look down the cemetery, and you can see that original plot just beneath you to your left, as I say, at a kind of different angle to the other headstones. And when you look at the graves that are in that original plot, you'll see a lot of men from the 11th Battalion, the Border Regiment. That was the Lonsdale Battalion, the battalion that gives this cemetery its name, and may well have been responsible for the naming of the Nab, where we've just come from. They were a battalion formed by the Earl of Lonsdale in September of 1914, a new army, a Kitchener's Army battalion that had their own distinct cap badge that was different from the normal Border Regiment badge. And on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, they were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel P.W. Michel, who was mortally wounded in the fighting here and died of his wounds in a casualty clearing station, is buried in Wailoy-Ballon Communal Cemetery. They lost 26 officers and 490 men in the fighting in this ground towards the village of Chatvale, which was part of their objective. And as with the Dorsets, that is a story for another day. But as we walk into the remainder of the cemetery, with over 1,500 British and Commonwealth burials, what we begin to see are the shattered remains of the lads of the 70th Brigade, because we can pick out the cap badges of the York and Lancaster Regiment, the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, and the Sherwood Foresters. There are 41 York and Lancs here, 52 King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, and a handful of Sherwood Foresters. Those are the graves that are identified. But when you walk the rows and rows of graves, men whose remains were found in this immediate area around Authuille Wood towards Auvergne and the Nab, many of the unknowns are partially unknown. So rather than being an unknown soldier of the Great War known unto God, it's an unknown lieutenant of the Sherwood Foresters, an unknown corporal of the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, an unknown soldier of the York and Lancaster Regiment, and so on. So you can see, knowing the cap badges and knowing the order of battle, these are graves that connect us to the story around the Nab. So there are many, countless casualties that were never identified from that attack that were subsequently buried here, because these men had only gone over with one identity disc. At this stage of the Battle of the Somme, soldiers just wore the red one or the 1906 aluminium pattern one, and when they were killed, comrade was there to see them killed. They would take the tag off the body and later hand that in, and that meant that there was nothing on the body, because they'd not just remove the tag, they'd take the pay book and personal effects for that to be passed back to the family. There would be nothing on that body to say who it was, and this was a great problem when these kind of battlefields were subsequently cleared. There was no way of identifying the casualties that were being found, which is why there are so many unidentified, partially identified, buried in cemeteries like this one, Lonsdale, where we are now. It's a place as you walk these rows to stop and think, really, because when you rest on the cemetery wall and look to the north, you can just catch the top of the Chatvale Memorial to the missing, where the missing of the Somme are commemorated. Because the vast number of those who fell at the Nab and in Nab Valley on that first day of the Battle of the Somme, those catastrophic losses amongst those 4 battalions of the 70th Brigade, most of them do not have a known grave. When I was researching those lads from South Yorkshire, I think only a handful out of hundreds had a known grave. Almost all of them were on the Chatvale Memorial, and their names listed on the seemingly endless panels of that Lutyens memorial. But each name a life, each name a man who was loved and loved himself, whose life ended in such a small piece of ground on the Somme more than a century ago. There's a sadness to this, but a compelling sadness, I think, that makes us return and want to uncover their stories further. And as we walk those Somme battlefields, we are drawn to the great names, the great battlefield sites, but the quiet corners are just as important, because here we find the ghosts of those who came this way in 1916, and for all those men from Yorkshire and the Midlands who fell in such great numbers at the Nab on the 1st of July, this was just as important to them as Serre was to the Powys or La Boisselle to the Tynesiders, because this, the Nab, for all time, was their part of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.